This year, Arts and Culture Show will be spending time in the company of Hever Castle historian Dr. Owen Emerson. Tonight we get up close to a portrait of Anne Boleyn as we uncover a hidden history.
Hever Castle is currently closed for a short period of conservation. And during these few weeks of closure, we have the opportunity to assess the condition of not only the castle and its furnishings, but also to analyse the 16th century portraits in our collection. The renowned art historian and dealer, Philip Mould of Fake or Fortune fame, has stated that Hever has the greatest privately owned public collection of portraits that tells the story of the Tudors. It's not hard to see why he thinks that. I am surrounded by stunning contemporary portraits of the vast majority of the key players of Henry VIII's court. And of course, we have 4 paintings of Anne Boleyn, who called this incomparable little castle home. Three of these portraits were painted long after Anne Boleyn's head was so brutally severed from her body. But one portrait of Anne here at Hever has remained something of a mystery. It is commonly known as the Hever Rose portrait, for in it Anne is shown holding the Red Rose of Lancaster. Now, it's undoubtedly a 16th century painting, but for many years it's been assumed to be a posthumous portrait and thought most likely to have been painted during the reign of Anne's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. Indeed, it's often stated that there are no contemporary portraits of Anne Boleyn, and that any made during her life were destroyed when Anne fell from grace. Certainly a similar portrait held in the National Portrait Gallery has been dated scientifically to 1584, when Anne's image was being restored during her daughter's reign. But it may surprise you to hear that few other paintings labelled as Anne Boleyn have been subjected to such scientific analysis, including ours here at Hever. Now, I'm just walking up the vast, long gallery to get a closer look at the painting in question. I have to confess, it remains one of my favourite images associated with Anne. She is shown wearing a black French hood, a rather daring headdress for the time which shows off her hairline. Rather risque at a time when it was far more conventional for women to cover their hair. Anne, of course, had spent 7 years at the French court and was fully conversant in the language and culture of that court. It was noted by one of her contemporaries that Anne was like a French woman born. Her headdress and neckline are covered in large pearls, and she has not only strings of pearls around her neck, but also a gold-work chain, and perhaps most famously, a pendant in the form of a letter B for Boleyn. To me, this shows a confident and stylish woman, proud of her familial heritage and promoting her family's wealth and status. Now, black, which she's covered in, her clothes are completely made of black material, was an incredibly coveted and expensive colour to wear, for it was an incredibly difficult colour to dye fabric to. Perhaps the bee necklace can be read here as bold, for her striking look is quite distinctive from the comparatively conservative English fashions. Is it any wonder that Anne stole the eye and heart of the king? This wasn't, however, the face of Anne that I saw when I visited as a child. Indeed, our Hever Rose portrait has undergone something of a makeover. In 2000, restoration work was carried out on the painting by the conservator Claudio Mascatelli. The most significant part of this conservation work was removing overpaint added at some point in the painting's history. Now, with the overpaint carefully removed, it became clear that the layers of paint had most likely been applied because of past damage to the panels. Now, most of the revealed damage appears to have occurred on the left of the 3 panels on which the painting had been constructed, with substantial losses evident along the joint between the left-hand and central panel. Indeed, it's very likely that the left-hand panel had at some point detached completely from the central one. As this damage ran through Anne's face, it's perhaps not surprising that the overpaint was most heavily applied on the chin, mouth, and nose. But what became evidence with the removal of this later overpaint was that it had also acted to, shall we say, smooth out these features, and perhaps more flattering ones had been applied than were originally intended. Indeed, it's evident that the overpaint had also been added to areas without paint losses, which contributed to this beautification. Perhaps another generation assumed Anne to be a great beauty, and this painting hadn't quite lived up to their expectations or understandings of what beauty was. Anne had never actually been famed for her looks. Even her closest friends remarked that she was moderately good-looking. But that later alteration has now been removed, and it feels like we are seeing the Anne that the painter had intended us to see. She has re-emerged from the veneer of time. Now, it isn't uncommon for portraits of this age to retain something of a mystery as to their age and their provenance, the history of who owned it and when. And yet our portrait, until recently, was a complete enigma. We had next to no information about it. We weren't even sure when it arrived here at Hever. Now, I've been working for some time alongside my friend and researcher Lee Porritt to try to uncover some of this beloved portrait story. Our earliest reference to a portrait of Anne here at Hever is in 1801, when the Meade-Waldo family owned the castle. And a visitor wrote that he was less than impressed with the portrait he saw. Indeed, we have several such references to this disappointing painting. Now, fascinatingly, a rather unimpressive portrait labelled as Anna Regina still survives in that family's collection. And it was marked by a visitor to be vastly dissimilar to another version of the bee necklace portrait at Loseley Hall. So we can deduce that it was most likely not our Hever Rose portrait that was seen here all those years ago. So when did it arrive here? Until Lee and I started digging, we only had references to it at Hever from 1965, and tragically, because of the extensive floods at Hever in 1968, precious little else in the cellar-based archives survived. However, we recently were able to find a guidebook for a Times newspaper staff event from 1939. And in it, we found a grainy photograph of the Hever Rose painting of Anne, demonstrating that it had been here since at least the late 1930s. And then we had a eureka moment. A reference was found in a book from 1904, detailing the paintings held at Assington Hall, a family estate of the Gurdon family. in this book described a painting of Anne Boleyn thusly. Queen Anne Boleyn, head and shoulders, body and face both turned slightly to the dexter, hair dressed in the pedimental style, dress black with pearls around the neck supporting a jewelled bee. There is also a gold chain. The hands are forward, holding a rose. Above it, Anne Regina. Now, in the many years that Lee and I have been studying paintings of Anne Boleyn, we have never found another painting labelled as Anne that is also accompanied by Anne Regina, save for the Hever Rose portrait. Is it possible, therefore, that our famous painting came from Assington Hall in Suffolk? Tantalisingly, we now believe that the Gurdon family were related to the Boleyns. Only time and more research into auction records will finally solve the riddle. Could our portrait be much older than it is previously thought to be? When it was exhibited at the Lost Faces exhibition in 2007, art historian Bendel Grosvenor and Philip Mould stated that it was the finest and probably the earliest of the corridor portraits of Anne Boleyn. Could we have, in spite of the belief that none exist, have been looking at a contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn all along? Anne Boleyn lost her head upon the orders of a king, her husband, who was intent on removing all trace of her from the earth. In her last breath, Anne implored those who had gathered to watch her die to judge the best if they sought to meddle in her cause. Well, here at Hever, we are meddling still, and we live in hope of being able to uncover Anne Boleyn's face once more.
Dr. Owen Emerson opening the doors of Hever Castle to us here on The Dominic King Show.